Before the skyscrapers, before the highways, before the very names New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania were ever spoken, this land had a name. It was Lenapehoking, the homeland of the Lenape people. For more than 10,000 years, they were the caretakers of this vast territory, of its forests, and of the rivers that pulsed through it like veins. Among the Lenape were a people whose identity was forged in the stony, rolling hills of the north. They called themselves the Munsee, a name derived from Min-asin-ink, the place where stones are gathered together. They were the people of the Stony Country. As a sub-tribe of the great Lenape nation, their story is deeply etched into the bedrock of America. It is a story often told as one of tragedy and disappearance, but that story is incomplete. The Munsee are still here. Their descendants live on as sovereign, federally recognized nations in Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and Canada. Their journey from the stony hills of their homeland to these new communities is a story of profound loss, but also of incredible resilience. It is a history of many trails, a path of forced removals that scattered a people across a continent but never broke their spirit. This is the story of the Munsee, a people whose name was tied to the land and whose survival is a testament to their endurance. The names given to them by others tell their own story of colonization. The English called them Delaware, after a river they had named for an English lord, Baron de Lawar, an act of renaming the people to match the colonizers' map. This linguistic dispossession was a prelude to the physical dispossession that would follow. It was an attempt to erase an identity rooted in place and replace it with a label of convenience. Yet through every trial, the people held to their own understanding of who they were. Before European contact, Munsee society was a world in balance, intricately woven into the fabric of the woodlands environment. As part of the Lenape, who were revered as the grandfathers among other Algonquian-speaking peoples, their culture was ancient and complex. Their society was organized around a matrilineal clan system. Identity, status, and property were passed down through the mother's line. Every person belonged to one of three primary clans: the wolf, the turtle, or the turkey. The Munsee themselves are most closely associated with the wolf clan, the Tuxedo. This structure was not just a matter of lineage, it was the foundation of their social and political world. Husbands would traditionally move into their wife's home, and women held a degree of power and control over their own property that was entirely foreign to the patriarchal societies of Europe. This fundamental difference in understanding family, power, and gender would become a silent, powerful source of misunderstanding in the centuries to come. When European men sought to negotiate for land, they naturally looked for male chiefs, failing to comprehend that in a matrilineal society, the authority to dispose of the land that sustained the clan likely rested with the clan mothers, a political reality that may have rendered many early agreements invalid from the start. Life followed the rhythm of the seasons. Munsee women were the cultivators, raising the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash, the sacred triad of crops that sustained their communities. Men were the hunters and fishers, tracking deer, moose, and smaller game with bow and arrow, and navigating the rivers in dugout canoes, using nets and traps to harvest the abundant fish. They lived in villages of circular bark-covered homes called wigwams, as well as larger communal longhouses. In the summer, they lived near their fields. In the fall and winter, they moved to inland camps for the hunt. A mother would carry a baby on her back in a cradleboard, keeping the child close while she worked. Their language, a dialect of the Lenape language from the Algonquian family, was distinct from that of their southern relatives, the Unami. While closely related, the Munsee and Unami dialects were different enough that speakers could not always understand one another, a linguistic separation reflecting a cultural divergence that archaeologists believe extends back thousands of years. Governance was not centralized, but achieved through consensus in village and inter-village councils, a democratic process that valued harmony and agreement over authority. It was a world built on reciprocity, kinship, and a deep spiritual connection to Lenapehoking. Into this balanced world sailed a new and disruptive force. The first encounters with Europeans, like Giovanni Verrazzano in 1524 and Henry Hudson in 1609, were cautious and often centered on trade. The Dutch, driven by a mercantile hunger for profit, sought the rich beaver and otter pelts of the region. The Munsee, in turn, desired European goods, metal kettles that were more durable than their pottery, steel blades that were sharper than their stone tools, and woven cloth of vibrant colors. This trade, however, was built on a foundation of misunderstanding that would soon crumble into conflict. For the Dutch, the exchange of goods was transactional, a means to an economic end. For the Munsee, exchange was an integral part of building and maintaining diplomatic relationships. This cultural chasm was nowhere more apparent than in the transactions for land. In 1626, the Dutch West India Company sought to establish a permanent headquarters for its colony of New Netherland. The infamous purchase of Manhattan Island for 60 guilders worth of goods is a story that has become a founding myth of New York City. But the only record of this event is a single letter written by a company agent in Amsterdam, not a deed or a treaty signed on the island itself. The very concept of the transaction was irreconcilable. The Dutch believed they were purchasing the land in fee simple, gaining exclusive and permanent ownership. The Munsee, however, did not view land as a commodity that could be bought or sold. Their concept was one of usufruct entitlement, the right to use the land and its resources. From their perspective, they were likely granting the Dutch a temporary lease, an agreement to share the island, not surrender it forever. This fundamental clash of worldviews sowed the seeds of resentment and violence. The Dutch grew frustrated when the Munsee continued to hunt, fish, and plant on land they considered theirs, while the Munsee watched in anger as Dutch livestock trampled their cornfields. The uneasy peace did not last. Under the aggressive leadership of Director General Kieft, the Dutch attempted to solidify their dominance by demanding tribute from the surrounding Munsee bands. When they resisted, Kieft unleashed a wave of terror. In 1643, his soldiers attacked unsuspecting Munsee refugee camps at Pavonia and Corlears Hook, massacring hundreds of men, women, and children in their sleep. This atrocity ignited a brutal conflict known as Kieft's War, as enraged Munsee warriors retaliated against Dutch settlements across the region. The violence was not a simple two-sided war. It was a chaotic, multipolar struggle that engulfed the entire region. The Dutch, a centralized power, proved adept at exploiting pre-existing rivalries between Indian nations. During Kieft's War, they secured alliances with the powerful Mohicans and Mohawks to the north, using them to pressure and attack Munsee groups like the Wekwiskeeks. This divide-and-conquer strategy shattered the potential for a unified Indian resistance, foreshadowing the fragmentation that would later define the Munsee diaspora. In 1655, the conflict known as the Peachtree War erupted. It wasn't, as the Dutch mistakenly believed, a war over a stolen peach. It was a massive retaliatory strike by the mighty Susquehannock nation and their Munsee allies who swept down on undefended New Amsterdam to punish the Dutch for conquering their allies in the colony of Sweden. Up higher on the Hudson, at the Dutch settlement of Wiltwyck, today's Kingston, tensions with the local Esopus band of Munsee exploded into two devastating conflicts known as the Esopus Wars. The first war began in 1659, sparked by an unprovoked attack by Dutch settlers on a group of Esopus who were celebrating after a day's work. The war ended with an uneasy truce and a bitter memory for the Esopus. The Dutch had sold some of their captured young men into slavery on the island of Curaçao. In 1663, The Esopus struck back first. Feigning a peaceful trade, their warriors infiltrated the stockade at Wiltwyck. At a signal, they launched a devastating surprise attack, burning homes and taking dozens of women and children captive. This tactic suggests they may have been waging a traditional mourning war, not to kill, but to take captives to adopt into their families, replenishing a population devastated by disease and the recent loss of those sold into slavery. The Dutch response was merciless. Aided by Mohawk guides and even warriors from other Munsee bands on Long Island, their soldiers waged a scorched earth campaign, burning Esopus fields and villages until the starving survivors were forced to surrender their lands. The wars for Lenapehoking had ended. The shattering. The 18th century brought new forms of dispossession. The legacy of peaceful coexistence established by William Penn in Pennsylvania was about to be systematically dismantled by his own sons through an act of staggering fraud. In 1737, Pennsylvania officials produced a dubious and likely forged document they claimed was a 1686 treaty. This deed supposedly granted them a tract of Lenape territory in the Delaware and Lehigh valleys, with its western boundary to be determined by the distance a man could walk in a day and a half. This became known as the walking purchase. The Munsee and other Lenape leaders, trusting in the agreements of their ancestors, agreed to honor the walk. They expected a leisurely stroll along a traditional river path, which would have ceded a modest amount of land. What they got was a calculated swindle. The colonists had secretly cleared a direct path through the forest and hired 3 of the fastest runners in the province. For a day and a half, the men ran, not walked. The fastest covered over 60 miles. To compound the fraud, surveyors then drew the northern boundary line not directly east to the Delaware River, but at a sharp northeast angle to the Lackawaxen River, exponentially increasing the land seized to a staggering 1.2 million acres, an area nearly the size of Rhode Island. When the outraged Lenape refused to leave, Pennsylvania authorities appealed to the Lenape's powerful rivals, the Iroquois Confederacy. At a council in 1742, the Iroquois spokesman, on behalf of the British, publicly humiliated the Lenape leaders and ordered them to leave. Betrayed by both treaty and diplomacy, the main body of the Munsee was forced from their homes, beginning a westward migration that would lead them to the Ohio River Valley and into a new, volatile frontier. As some Munsee were pushed west by fraud, others chose a different path, seeking refuge in a new faith. Beginning in the 1740s, missionaries from the Moravian Church found remarkable success among the displaced Lenape. Unlike other missionaries, the Moravians learned indigenous languages, respected many cultural traditions, and lived as equals within the communities they served. They established mission towns like Gnadenhutten, huts of grace, which offered a haven of peace and order. For a time, it seemed like a viable path to survival, but the Christian Munsee soon found themselves caught in the crossfire of a new conflict, the American Revolution. As avowed pacifists, they refused to take sides, making them objects of suspicion to both the British allied tribes and the American militias. In March of 1782, that suspicion turned fatal. A contingent of Pennsylvania militiamen seeking revenge for raids conducted by other warriors descended on the peaceful Munsee mission of Gnadenhutten in Ohio. They found a community of Christian Munsee harvesting their corn. The Munsee calmly proclaimed their innocence and their Christian faith, explaining their commitment to nonviolence. The soldiers held a vote. The verdict was death. Over the course of 2 days, the militia systematically executed 96 people, 28 men, 29 women, and 39 children. They were killed with mallets, their bodies left in the burning mission buildings. The Gnadenhutten massacre was a horrific trauma, a moment that laid bare a devastating truth.
The walking purchase had proven that engaging with the colonial legal system was no defense against greed. Now, Gnadenhutten proved that even total cultural and religious assimilation was no defense against racial hatred. To the militia, they were not Christians, they were simply Indians. With both negotiation and assimilation having failed as strategies for survival, the only path left was to flee. The Great Diaspora had begun. The decades following the American Revolution saw the Munsee people scattered across the continent. Driven by violence, land theft, and relentless pressure from American expansion, they embarked on a series of forced migrations, the many trails that would lead them to new homes but also forge new identities. Many Munsee, especially those who had allied with the British during the Revolution, and the Christian Munsee survivors fleeing the violence that culminated at Gnadenhutten, sought refuge in Canada. In the 1780s, they established new communities along the Thames River in Ontario. One group of refugees settled at Munsee Town, which would become the Munsee-Delaware Nation. Another group, the Moravian converts, founded a new settlement in 1792 that became the Delaware Nation at Moravian Town. Their allegiance to the British would be tested again in the War of 1812, when American forces burned Moravian Town to the ground, forcing the people to flee and rebuild yet again. Another trail led west, in an alliance forged through a shared Christian faith and a common Algonquin heritage. Remnants of the Munsee joined with the Stockbridge people, a community of Christianized Mohicans from the Hudson Valley. This combined group was pushed from their home in Stockbridge, Massachusetts after the Revolution. The Oneida Nation offered them land in New York, but American settlement pressure soon made that home untenable. In the 1810s, they attempted to move to Indiana, only to arrive and find the land they had been promised had been sold out from under them. Finally, in the 1820s and 30s, they negotiated for land in Wisconsin. In 1836, a group of Munsee families migrating from Canada joined them, and together they became officially known as the Stockbridge Munsee community. Even then, their journey was not over. They were moved several more times within Wisconsin before a treaty in 1856 finally established their permanent reservation in Shawano County, their home to this day. The largest group of Lenape, including many Munsee descendants, was relentlessly pushed west. From Pennsylvania, they were forced into Ohio and then Indiana. The Treaty of St. Mary's in 1818 forced them to cede their Indiana lands. With the passage of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, their fate was sealed. They were moved to a reservation in Kansas in the 1830s, but after the Civil War, pressure from settlers and railroad companies became unbearable. In 1866, the U.S. government signed its final treaty with the Delaware, forcing them to sell their Kansas lands and move one last time to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. There, they purchased land from the Cherokee Nation and established a new home. The descendants of the Munsee and their Unami relatives who walked this final, painful trail are today the federally recognized Delaware Nation based in Anadarko, Oklahoma. This diaspora was more than a scattering of people. It was the forging of new nations. The communities that exist today are not simply Munsee in a new location. They are unique sovereign entities, shaped by the specific alliances they made and the distinct historical paths they were forced to walk.